Welcome to Flipped Classroom. Today's lesson is a book talk about the article, The Case for Reparations. In this article, Ta-Nehisi Coates is building his case in favor of a reparations program in the United States. Think of him as a lawyer talking to a jury, and you, the audience, the reader, are the jury. And he's presenting evidence of all the abuse that slaves endured in captivity and the abuse that Black people faced after the slaves were freed in 1865 through Jim Crow laws and other racist practice by individuals and the government. He begins chapter 1 with the story of Clyde Ross. Here's an individual who had been robbed of opportunities. You see how he had a horse taken away from him, which meant he had no transportation to school, no opportunities to have enjoyment like any other child. When his family was unable to earn the money for a suit that he was promised due to the unethical treatment of sharecroppers, he was unable to go to church. He was unable to further his education. And those injustices didn't stop as a child for Clyde Ross. Even after serving his country in the war, when he went to buy a home, he couldn't buy it like any other white American could. Instead, he was swindled into buying his house on contract, which meant he would never really own his own home. He would have the same responsibilities as a homeowner, but none of the perks that go along with being a renter. In chapter 2, Ta-Nehisi Coates goes more in depth into the Chicago suburb of North Lawndale, where Clyde Ross lives. This chapter has many statistics to support Ta-Nehisi Coates' case. On page 579, according to the most recent statistics, North Lawndale is now on the wrong end of virtually every socioeconomic indicator. In 1930, its population was 112,000. Today, it's 36,000. The neighborhood is 92% Black. Its homicide rate is 45 per 10,000. Triple the rate of the city of Chicago as a whole. The infant mortality rate is 14 per 1,000, more than twice the national average. And the statistics don't stop there. The whole chapter is supported with credible research. On page 580, Black families, regardless of income, are significantly less wealthy than white families. The Pew Research Center estimates that white households are worth roughly 20 times as much as Black households. On page 581, Ta-Nehisi Coates points out, the essence of American racism is disrespect. And in the wake of these grim numbers, we see the grim inheritance. The Contract Buyers League suit brought by Clyde Ross and his allies took direct aim at this inheritance. So the Black people of the community were standing up against the powers that be and saying, enough is enough. No longer are Black people going to be treated with this disrespect that has been trickling down for generations. Ta-Nehisi Coates switched gears and looks at the history of reparations. As part of building his case, he's trying to prove that reparations aren't some wild idea. It is something that this country has a history of doing. Started with Belinda Royal, and when she was freed as a slave from the estate of her owner, she received 15 pounds and 12 shillings. On page 582, he writes about the Quakers. The Quakers in New York, New England, and Baltimore went so far as to make membership contingent upon compensating one's former slaves. In 1782, the Quaker Robert Pleasants emancipated his 78 slaves, granted them 350 acres, and later built a school on their property and provided for their education. So land, a place to live, and education to better yourselves. Coates gives another example. Edward Coles, a protege of Thomas Jefferson. He granted his slaves a plot of land in Illinois. John Randolph, a cousin of Thomas Jefferson, willed that all his slaves be emancipated upon his death and that all those older than 40 be given 10 acres of land. So there is a history of reparations in the United States. It is not a new concept. On page 583, Coates points out the opposition, those who believe there should be no reparations. He starts with one of the most disturbing allegations and writes, slaves have been taught Christian civilization and to speak the noble English language instead of some African gibberish. The count is square with the ex-slaves. In other words, this elitist attitude of, well, these were black people in Africa that weren't as civilized as us elite white Americans are. So, yes, they were slaves, but we gave them a gift by showing them God and showing them civilized behavior. There's a lot of assumptions in there that are just thrown out there. Later on page 583, he points out to some of the more common oppositions that we hear in the 21st century. Broach the topic of reparations today, and a barrage of questions inevitably follows. Who will be paid? How much will they be paid? Who will pay? These are questions you might hear in your everyday life. You even might feel the same. I don't own slaves. None of my family members own slaves. I would never own slaves. So why should I have to give my hard-earned dollars to black people? It's not my fault. It isn't a reflection of my values. And even if I did believe in reparations, I don't have that kind of money to give to every black person in the United States. And speaking of black people, none of the black people today are slaves. So why are we giving them money when the slaves are all dead? These are ideas we hear all the time. And Ta-nehisi Coates has a rebuttal. He argues that that black people today deserve reparations because the abuse didn't end the day the slaves were freed. He uses Clyde as an example, North Lawndale as an example, lynchings, redlining, a myriad of reasons to show that black people today continue to be abused, whether it is by the government or individual racists. He writes on page 584, the high point of the lynching era has passed, but the memory of those robbed of their lives still live on in the lingering effects. Indeed, in America, there's a strange and powerful belief that if you stab a black person 10 times, the bleeding stops and the healing begins the moment the assailant drops the knife. Think about that. Stab 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Up! Bleeding's gonna stop. Everything's okay. That's the analogy. Black people for generations have been metaphorically stabbed. And all of a sudden in the 21st century we go, oh, the bleeding has stopped. The pain is over. He is arguing that is illogical analogy. And also that everyone living in the USA today benefited from slaves. It is because the slaves worked so hard that white people had opportunities to go to school, to be creative, to invent all the great technologies because they weren't separated from their families like slaves were. They had family support. They had time to go to school. They didn't have to do the backbreaking labor. And we reap all those benefits today in the great technologies that we have. So in review, Ta-nehisi Coates lays the foundation for his case for reparations in the first 3 chapters. I look forward to seeing you in my next book talk, which will cover chapters 4 through 7. Thank you for joining me today in Flipped Classroom.